When we are talking about radicalization into extremist violence or extremist ideologies, we have to remember that this is a process. No one is born radical or extreme or terrorist, so it takes time. But it takes a number of reasons, typically individual reasons that move people to join such groups. We did very extensive research with a number of individuals who ended up in terrorist groups or extremist groups. And when you start talking to them, it becomes obvious that they joined these groups initially, not because they wanted to become terrorists or extremists, but they were in pursuit of fulfillment of their social needs. Because they explained how they were welcomed, someone served coffee, they offered them to sleep over, someone offered them the job, someone talked to them, so they felt like appreciated. And then you realize that this is something they didn't have in their immediate family. So very often people are in pursuit of satisfaction of their basic human and social needs that they cannot fulfill typically within their primary families. So they're looking for secondary families, not biological but ideological families. So they are joining these groups not to become eventually terrorists or extremists, but simply to feel appreciated, to fulfill the sense of belonging. And then, the extremist ideologies and extremist behaviors come always at the end of the process. And we typically refer to the process as a staircase to terrorism, for example. So there's a number of steps that lead towards the final stage when an individual is radicalized to the extent that he or she is willing to kill another human being in pursuit of some ideological goal. But the initial number of people who enter this staircase and the end number of people do not correspond. It's typically thousands of people who enter this initial process, but at the end of it, it's only one or two, a very small group of people. But when we are talking about radicalization into extremism, we are always talking about a process. To the extent how much economic hardship plays a role in embracing individuals embracing radical ideologies and extremist behaviors, it does play a role. But in some cases, of course. If that was if the economic hardship was the sole catalyst of people who are joining extremist groups, the whole continent of Africa would be a terrorist continent, because people in Africa typically live in poverty or are faced with economic hardship. So it does play a role, but doesn't play the decisive role. And after all, we know of terrorists who were extremely wealthy. Osama bin Laden was extremely wealthy. He came from an extremely wealthy Saudi family. There are a number of individuals who ended up being a terrorist who come from families who had an abundance of money. So we cannot narrow down, the appeal of radical ideologies, of racism, terrorism, to just economic hardship. It's typically some kind of grievance, some kind of need that individual is trying to pursue. And typically these individuals embrace what's the nearest and what's the most obvious option for them. Unfortunately, radical groups, football hooligan groups, extremist groups where they feel like they belong, there's a sense of belonging in these groups, there's dynamics in these groups that reinforces this sense of belonging. So we are seeing a lot of people that we typically consider vulnerable to a whole sort of things. And this vulnerability makes them prone to embracing whole sort of ideas, including those that are radical or extreme. When it comes to European governments, and how they are dealing with extremism, I think that the European governments over the last 10 years were primarily focused on prevention of radical extremism and terrorism, trying to defend their own soil from terrorist attacks that typically were organized or sponsored from abroad. But over the last few years, we are seeing things gradually changing. The civil war in Syria and Iraq had stopped. The ISIL has been military defeated, so the European governments have to deal with their own internal problems that deal with a rise in right-wing ideologies, racism, white supremacy, and we are seeing these developments in very developed democratic countries. And we are, I believe, quite rightly concerned because of these developments. So do they have a strategy? They do. But, you know, these strategies are typically based on a securitized approach. It gives police, security agencies, intelligence agencies a lot of authority. But prevention of violent extremism, prevention of racism is a task for the whole of society. So it cannot be narrowed down to just police. Police itself, they cannot deal with only terrorism, extremism, or right-wing, left-wing ideologies. It has to be a task for the society, for the education, for people, you know, in all walks of life, from families to you know, public domain. Right-wing extremism in Scandinavia is not a new development. It's been there also for quite some time. It's typically believed that the influx of immigrants led to some kind of renaissance of right-wing ideologies in Sweden, in Norway, in Denmark as well. But I'm not sure that that's absolutely true. It's been there for quite some time, and it probably just needed an incentive to explode in a way that it had over the last few years. But it has been visible even before, though we are considering these countries as leftist or liberal, and in essence they are. But this right-wing movement was rather dormant and was not so obvious and visible until it was ignited with the influx of refugees and immigrants from other parts of the world. And there is in this racist white supremacy circles this fear of replacement. They call it replacement theory. They believe, they are trying to introduce the belief that you know, people who are not Christian and who are not white are actually trying to replace them and to take away their privileges. And this is something that we are seeing in the United States, something that we saw in other European countries, and this was obviously very developing, a very worrying development over the last few years. But the elections in a number of West European countries over the last year are actually suggesting that the right wing is losing public support, popular support, and the people are leaning more towards the Green parties and to liberal spectrum of political organizations there. Well, like I said before, having or espousing extremist or radical views on a number of things is of course worrying, but it's legal. So as long as we don't incite, finance, encourage or engage ourselves into violence in order to promote certain worldview through ideology, it's fine. And many people who harbor extremist views also never become violent. But you know, who becomes violent and why? It typically depends on a number of circumstances that are both personal and general, structural in nature. So when we are trying to dissect the phenomenon of terrorism, we really have to be very careful and to look on the case-by-case basis, because every single case is on its own. In every single case is actually different. In the essence, typically people are motivated with some kind of deprivation or injustice. This injustice can be political, it can be cultural. There are minorities who live in majority countries deprived of political organization, deprived of using their own language in public institutions, their own alphabets. These are the structural reasons for dissatisfaction and for grievance. But you have millions of people who are exposed to same kind of injustice without ever becoming either radical or extreme or terrorist in essence. So when we are trying to understand the phenomenon, we always have to look at every case on a case-by-case basis. Otherwise, it's very difficult to understand. We tend to generalize things, and when you generalize it, you actually lose the sight of nuances that are typically the most important ones.